Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Katherine Oliver, joined by my distinguished panel of experts, and we're just thrilled to be here. Jenny Rowlands, Ivo, and Theo, so welcome again. Theo, I'm going to start with you. We're talking about how the lives of urban citizens are impacted by technology. You are London's first Chief Digital Officer. Can you give us some examples of how London is using data and technology to improve city life overall for residents? And you've been on the job now for just over 2 years?
18 months.
All right,
so,
thereabouts.
So London, data to London is incredibly important. Actually, when you look at our digital economy, it's kind of like a data economy with our expertise in AI and our research facilities and our tech specialisms. But when we look at civic uses, London was one of the first cities around to promote open data. It's Data Store in 2010, and now we're in the 5th year of Transport for London's Open API, which allows a large number of live data feeds, which have created a whole community of applications, including City Mapper, which many of you will have used to get here. This is because the city has published open data. Now, beyond that, there are all sorts of civic uses, which we think there's great potential for in London. Below the mayoral governance layer, there are 32 London boroughs, each of which deliver a huge number of services, and lying behind that, a huge amount of data about our citizens. If we can build our capabilities to collaborate and use data, both public and private data sets, we think there's huge potential to meet the challenges of London, namely that by the middle of the next decade, we're going to be the largest we've been since the Victorian period. In the middle of the next of this century,
and what are the projections?
Another 2 million people. So how are we going to deal with transport questions and public services, air quality? All of these issues will be solved in part by data, either in the hands of citizens or augmenting our public service professionals and entrepreneurs to provide solutions.
Mm-hmm. Now, Jenny, there are a lot of folks here from the business sector. Can you explain the role of a local authority in London and what you do exactly as this chief executive of Camden?
Yeah, so I'll talk a bit, so local authority generally in London, and then I'll talk a bit about Camden. So as Theo said, we provide the services, anything, I think it said in your programme, from something as mundane but contentious as collecting your bins to parking. If you imagine more restrictions around parking and people wanting resident parking, obviously we provide services to about 240,000 people in Camden residents, and then to our businesses, and we're trying to get people to work alongside each other in harmony. So we provide to our general public, and then obviously we have very specialist services. So obviously safeguarding, if you think of trust, we do anything from allowing you just to access our data for kind of general day-to-day services, right down to holding extremely sensitive data around safeguarding our most vulnerable citizens, looking at where we actually intervene and take children into care. So you can imagine the kind of potential, but also the sensitivities around the services we provide. I think in Camden, I'd like to say for this conference, we've got amazing opportunity. I don't know how well you know the borough, but it is a borough that people would see as very wealthy, but it also has world-class institutions that we're incredibly connected to, so British Museum, British Library, UCL, LSE, SOAS, all of the big companies that are on our business boards. We have huge wealth. We also have huge wealth and health inequalities. We have some of the most deprived wards in the country sitting next to world-class organisations. So one of our really big challenges is how do we use tech and how do we provide services that break down the kind of health and wealth inequalities in local government. The big move in local government, if you imagine in a business, is we've lost about 57% of our budget in the last 10 years at a time where our demand has grown. And so what we need to do is make sure we're getting services out at the right level to the right people. A lot of that is about us getting out of the way and letting people work together without a bureaucratic response, so building trust and having transaction outside of local government. A very specific example is we used to always take young people with learning disability on buses to wherever they were going to. Now we use apps like Travel Buddy. That's much more than you can imagine. That's about really trusting people to get somewhere and having those kind of strength-based conversations.
Mm-hmm. Now, Ivo, you are the founder of GoodGym, which is a growing movement of runners who run for good. Proud to say that you're also a recipient of Bloomberg Philanthropy Cities of Service recognition as well, so that's great. Tell us a little bit about GoodGym and what inspired you to create it.
So really it was a solution to my own problem, which was that I wasn't doing any exercise, and my friends were saying I should go to the gym, and I just didn't like that idea of going into a sweaty basement and lifting loads of things that don't really need lifting, and thought, what if you could put all of that energy that is being wasted into doing something useful? And so that was where the idea of a platform that would connect those who want to exercise more with tasks that need doing that would benefit communities. And so I started running just to deliver the newspaper to an isolated older neighbour, and that has now grown into a community of 15,000 runners in 50 different local authority areas across the UK. So yeah, it's taken some time, but it's very much about connecting people at a local level, making it easier for people to make a difference where they live.
How is GoodGym connecting people at the grassroots level? How exactly? Can you...
So more tangible examples. So tonight, if anyone feels like it, you could join us for a run this evening at 6:30. There'll be about 15 different groups around London who will meet up and then run probably around 5 or 6 kilometres to go and help with a community project. That might be shifting and sorting food at a food bank. It might be renovating a playground. It might be helping with a school. So they're always physical tasks. They're 90-minute sessions, makes it very easy to get involved. This all sounds very un-data-y at the moment, but particularly our work with older people enables us to take the data of needs that is coming potentially from partners like a local authority or the British Red Cross, and match that to the availability of runners. So all the time we're trying to improve our knowledge and open up that data on both sides. When are people available and which tasks need doing?
And you were a resident of Camden up until recently?
Lived in Camden most of my life, now over in Tower Hamlets, not too far.
So Camden has the reputation of really being ahead of the curve on digital. Jenny, what's the next big digital project that residents there can look forward to?
Well, we don't know yet, because we're doing a thing called an external digital challenge, where we've just invited partners from across the private sectors, from Paris, from other local authorities to come and critique us, and they're literally out talking to our residents and our businesses at the moment to find out how we're doing and what they think we should be doing more or less of. And I guess some of the things we expecting ourselves to be able to do respond very quickly to are some of the biggest social challenges at the moment. So we do citizens' assemblies around the biggest issues. So housing is a very big issue. We had a lot of work around youth violence and youth safety that we're trying to connect people and see how we can work across the borough. The next big one, if anyone's interested in working with us, is around climate action and climate crisis. That's going to start with a citizens' assembly, but also we use a platform, Commonplace, we use just to talk to people, but it's like we have a huge response at the moment in Camden. Theo mentioned things like air quality, people's concerns about what's happening with, in Camden to keep it a great place for people to grow up in, particularly child-friendly. So I guess one of our responses is to respond to what we're being asked for. Another area, obviously, is we're doing, as I said, a lot of transformation work around vulnerable people and assisted technology around older people in particular, and social isolation. to kind of a lot of the stuff we were hearing about.
Right. So you're saying that you're clearly changing the lives of residents there, but how are you getting that feedback? I mean, mostly you probably get complaints when about the bins or the pickup, but how do you interact with the residents and how do you solicit the feedback on some of these things that you've addressed?
Because that is always a challenge. I mean, we were talking about, I am a big, obviously, supporter of Camden. It is an unusual authority. I don't know if anyone lives there. We have a very active community. So we do get our feedback very live time, not just through complaints. So again, in terms of opportunity, when we go out to our citizens' assemblies, we have community conversations where we go out with partners. So we're trying to set up a kind of neighbourhood spaces where people can come. One of the big issues is that we're trying to always get past the usual suspects to people who are furthest away from our services and our opportunities. But wherever we go, we have very articulate public who want to get involved, and about 80% of the public that talk to us say they would actively work with us to improve the lives in Camden. So one of the things is how do we capture all that data and look at what our next set of actions are. We've got a thing called Camden 2025 where we've gone out with 5 challenges, and then over the next few years kind of working with our communities to see how we can meet those together.
Have you gotten feedback on GoodGym and have you taken part?
So Camden was an early adopter.
Camden was one of it was the second or third area in which we launched, and there's now a big GoodGym community in Camden covering the whole borough.
And a serious point that we're looking at as we're trying to set up our own kind of innovation space. So we do a lot of talking to people. We simply haven't captured. We say Camden's a good local authority, but if you were looking at our resources and who was alongside us and who was on our business boards and the kind of level of activity and innovation in tech, why aren't we much better than anyone else? And so one of the challenges we're looking at is setting up a kind of innovation space where we invite partners in to look at how we capture that data. We're looking at micro-volunteering from citizens, like 15-minute slots, which kind of sits alongside your work. So how can people who want to do something just do it easily with us? We have an app, for example, on rough sleeping, because people don't just want to walk past and see someone sleeping rough and do nothing. At the moment, that just allows you to report. What we want to do is report, get involved, work with us while we do our Roots Off the Streets work. So just kind of find where people's passion is and work with them, and that way get that kind of feedback live.
But Ivo, from your perspective of managing this organization and this initiative, how do you measure impact and how are you measuring success?
I mean, we measure our outputs and outcomes. Our outcomes for us are about improved physical and mental well-being. So we support around 3,000 to 4,000 isolated older people every year. We measure their well-being using a scale called the Warwick Edinburgh Wellbeing Scale, which is a fairly straightforward but well-benchmarked measure. And we can show an improvement for both the older people but also the runners, and I think that's something very interesting that's going on in cities around the world, but particularly the US and the UK, that we're now finding that actually younger people are the most isolated. So as you go throughout your life, you're going to feel more and more connected. So this idea of this isolated older person is pretty much fiction. I mean, they definitely do exist, but the fact that it's connected to old age, the evidence at the moment is saying that is not the case. So I suppose what's very interesting in this hyper connected world, and the people who are using this technology the most are the ones who are most likely to be feeling lonely.
It's a solitary experience. They're just on their phone searching, and they're not honing their social skills to interact with others.
But how many of these things are social networks or dating apps? Or so many of these things are designed actually to bring us together and aren't making that job happen. I mean, they aren't making that happen in a way that actually gets to our fundamental needs. I mean, I think that's what's interesting about Jenny's responsibility, and what Theo's trying to do is I suppose, is open up data that will help organisations like ours to help people connect in a way that resolves their fundamental human needs, whether that's access to food, to bin collection, or to actually, friendship and feeling like you belong.
Theo, your passion is to connect people in a big way in London, and just last night you launched the London Office of Technology and Innovation, or LOTI. Can you tell us a little bit about that initiative and what your hopes are? It really is a connective tool.
Yeah, so in this last 18 months, I've had the opportunity, actually, partly through our connection with Bloomberg Associates, to meet chief digital officers of other big cities across the world. And what's interesting is that all cities face the same challenges, manifested in slightly different ways. And one big one is collaboration. London has big sort of agencies like Transport for London and the Ambulance Service and the Metropolitan Police. And they're kind of characteristic of the big city agencies that you'd see elsewhere in the world. But we also have 32 boroughs, and trying to, all of which have their own innovation record, kind of deal with technology in a slightly different way. And our collective knowledge of all of those things together is one of the things that we really need to improve in a city. So how do we become greater than the sum of our parts? As I say, other big cities face these challenges. If you go to San Francisco or New York, there'll be whatever it's called, the sanitation department, which does things in one way, and the, social services department that would do things in another way. But the same issue arises. How do you get the innovators in London, in London's public services, to work together and be more open to the ecosystem? Part of it is sort of groundwork, like data sharing agreements and things like that. But another part of it is really more kind of emotional. It's about the idea of a movement of creators and makers connecting with each other, stepping outside of professional boundaries. Public agencies aren't just like kind of silos, a department here and a department there. They're also made up of really complex networks and histories of professions who all treat data and innovation in a slightly different way, just from their professional backgrounds. So our challenge is to create new institutions almost for this digital age, to bring those people who want to make those changes together. So the London Office of Technology and Innovation, which will benefit all London's public services and work closely together with the university and the tech ecosystem, is based upon how we get those innovators together, starting with the London boroughs, including Camden and Westminster, where we are now, who have the biggest hunger. Because we wanted to start with those people who really wanted to make a difference, rather than just open the doors to the classroom and say anyone can come in and see what happened. We thought, kind of, let's go the other way around. Let's just start with the people who want to be there and move on that basis and leave the door open for others. So.
But on a practical basis, what does it mean and what will LOTI do? So I'm living in Islington and I want to move to Camden. So what's going to change now because of LOTI?
Yeah, so I mean, at first, it's kind of like a government-to-government operation, because our main challenge is common capabilities. What we want to do is move away from our dependence on inflexible old technologies and create common building blocks, maybe sometimes using open source approaches and software, building our own capabilities together, setting the standards so that a good idea in one place can easily be adopted somewhere else without a technological barrier. So capability first is a really, really important step. We also need to improve the digital leadership of our public services so that people can take the steps that the leading authorities are doing. So looking out of the council building and recognizing that there is a need to engage that tech firm that has just moved into your area and thinking, how best do I do this? So these are all really, really important tasks for public services. And by creating this kind of movement and this common set of experiences and standards and some technical requirements, we want London to start moving forward together. even if we're doing projects, instead of like an expensive pilot in one borough, which may well work really well, but if we can do something in 3 or 4 boroughs, 4 London boroughs working together is the size of Birmingham.
Right.
So.
Jenny, Camden has undergone enormous transformation in the last decade, and you talked earlier about what's to come. Talk about the public-private partnerships that may or may not exist, and how are you working with local businesses, academic institutions, data innovation experts?
Yeah, well, I think that is the big question. So when Theo was talking, so we do bits, we do pilots. We have, our academic institutions absolutely have an open door to us and say collaborate with us. We have great businesses. What we haven't done until really quite recently is say, well, what would happen if we absolutely open like a call to action to businesses who share our values and who can see what needs to happen in communities to reconnect and to create that sense of trust and community together? What would that look like if a borough like Camden just said, just come and do that with us? Mm-hmm. We'll try and enable with you through whatever levers we can use for us to work together. We'll give you space for us to learn quickly, prototype quickly, move at scale in a way that just hasn't happened. I think that's what Theo was talking about. But more delightfully, it's really hard to get this across to people that aren't in local authority. What we'd really like to do is just get out of the way and allow, because what's actually happened, and you could have a whole, if you want to stay afterwards, like we can give you a history of local government. You just simply wouldn't believe how much we get in the way of people talking to each other in our roles of safeguarding and checking you out. We probably, with the best intentions, got in the way a lot of people talking to each other in neighbourhoods and getting rid of things like social isolation, connecting businesses to each other. So I guess the other thing we're trying to do is really say, come into the space and take it. We will work with our citizens. We're looking at things like digital citizens charter so that we can make sure our public feels safe in how we share data. But beyond that, we just want to experiment.
Can I just add? I mean, I've talked about the benefits of data. I mean, the amount of data held by local authorities is truly amazing. And Jenny's talked about the sensitivity of that data. The conversation that we have with citizens about some of this sensitive data is really important, and I think can only be led by local democratic institutions. We're doing some work in the Mayor of London's office on violence reduction. In other words, trying to prevent knife crime repeating in this city. And that understanding the background of some of these young people involves really, really quite sensitive data. When you talk to some citizens from the communities most affected, their view about data is not necessarily a very positive one. Their view about data is data that has been put upon them as means of control, data that has meant their child has been excluded from a school, data that they don't trust because someone has used it against them. So the conversation around that data and beginning to have that conversation around data actually opens up a really, really broad discussion, which then takes us on to not really a discussion about data, but a discussion about how we design services together. And these two things, I think London has a really, really good opportunity around. One is leading a discussion on data, and secondly, a discussion around another one of our city's strengths, which is design. Sometimes these things have kind of happened in parallel, so there's sort of design over there and data over here. But imagine if we can bring those two forces together. That would benefit not only public services, but I think also just open up a much broader range of civic engagement.
We're running out of time, so we're going to just go around for some final thoughts, but I'm going to start with Ivo. A lot of business people in the audience, just looking at your model for GoodGym, I understand you now have 50 locations across the UK. How do you remain faithful to your original business model when operating on such a large scale?
I mean, it's been actually quite difficult to stick to doing the same thing. I mean, very often people will say, how about we, fund you to do this, something slightly different, pulling you in different directions. I think we've done well to stay, focused on that same challenge. But and so we haven't actually had to change that much, which I think is a strength. We've been able to get better at doing what we do. But just to sort of respond to what Theo was saying, I suppose that's hugely important for us. What we find is that we're working in a sector where with very, very similar goals. Us, the Red Cross, Age UK, lots of these different organisations working in Camden, but also working in lots of other local authority areas, all have that same goal, but we don't have that any kind of shared data that is live. We don't have any shared data language that we can use. And I think if we can get towards that, then we can have very interesting situations where we're actually sharing caseloads. What if there was an adult social care API? It's probably a bit too crude to say that. But if we could have some kind of shared data format for some of these bigger social challenges, of which the TfL data is a great first example. Perhaps there's an open active API now, which is about sharing physical activity, the opportunities. But if we can build on that and build that into some of our bigger social challenges, such as adult social care, what type of services would emerge around that? What type of collaborations would emerge around that is the sort of, just where I'd like to see the discussion go.
Interesting.
And Jenny, aside from joining GoodGym and participating, what are some of your hopes, for the near future? You've got an ambitious plan, but how you're using technology locally.
Yeah, so I think to finish off the discussion here is exactly, I think what local authority can do is kind of bring the trust of the community, look at the kind of the ethics and the sensitivities around data sharing, to open up into our communities in a way that we probably haven't seen before at a time that I think we all recognise that we need to have those connections for services, for cohesion, for some of the kind of social issues, but we haven't touched on things like housing and what the new generation of housing
subject
and
of another panel discussion.
Exactly. So I guess, our aspiration is that we make the most of the offer that is London and Camden at the moment, and we bring our communities with us.
All right. Theo, just quickly, some final thoughts, and then we're going to have to wrap it up.
I think that as the discussion about the use of data plays out, the ability of our local democratic institutions to be part of it is really important. I don't think, government frameworks with high-level principles will be ones that necessarily will provide the kind of granular support that you need to do a job like Jenny's or to run public services. We need to kind of equip ourselves with a different kind of framework based upon people's experience, which is why we're starting work on essentially a framework for questions that public servants can ask of artificial intelligence and the use of data, so that we can provide effectively that paper trail and assurance that data is being used in the right way. Because frankly, in some of the questions now, if challenged, some public services would struggle to find a response. So in order for us to be open to innovation, we need to do that groundwork, and that's a real priority for us now.
Okay. Jenny Rowlands, Ivo Gormley, Theo Blackwell, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for the interesting conversation.
Thank you.